and ethically challenged scientists. Well, that's partially true, but it is not it's not something that is only from 100 years ago. Brainwashing or coercive persuasion continues to be active and to develop even a century later. And yes, there were some bad scientists involved, but there were also Nobel laureates involved. And some were ethically challenged. But I think the story of brainwashing is really the history of those individuals and the social forces they were caught up in. So I'd like to give you an overview of my book by highlighting some of the 20th century events where brainwashing has been evoked. Throughout this talk, please consider two questions. Was this event a manifestation of brainwashing? And what aspects of the event shaped your opinion? Well, in my previous book, Anatomy of Malice, I focused on understanding how state leaders could orchestrate malice on a genocidal level. Subsequently, I started wondering about how a population could be persuaded to follow such a path. Were they inherently murderous, as Daniel Goldhagen suggested? Were they hoodwinked by propaganda? Or were they brainwashed? And what did that term even mean? Where did it come from? Even despite my interest in the topic, I would probably never have written the book if it weren't for my neighbors who were members of the Heaven's Gate commune. A few miles away from us, our neighbors had themselves castrated and then committed a mass suicide so they could teleport to the stars. It's one thing when there's a suicidal cult half a world away, but when it's your neighbors, it demands study. And so I began my work on dark persuasion. Now, before we go into this very far, we need to ask a question about terminology, and it's a very important topic, particularly with brainwashing. It's such a flamboyant term. What does this term mean? There are lots of other terms that refer to aspects of persuasion, indoctrination, conversion, propaganda, or even education. But in its essence, brainwashing involves duress or intimidation. Frequently, the victim is isolated and subjected to harm while being manipulated. The best term is coercive persuasion, but the word brainwashing vastly dominates the general usage. People have been coerced by torture for centuries, but it's not so clear that torture changes actual belief. Religious conversion, likewise, is an old process that has sometimes been coerced. But the beginning of coercive persuasion dates to the Russian Nobel laureate Ivan Pavlov, who brought scientific methods to changing behavior. For decades, the West was preoccupied that Pavlov and the Soviets had made some kind of unholy alliance to change people's beliefs and actions. As the CIA observed, Soviet psychology is concerned with the concepts of Pavlov, the belief that men can be deliberately made to develop pre-designed types of thoughts and behaviors. Some of Pavlov's observations stemmed from an unusual natural phenomenon, the flooding of the Neva River. Let me read a portion from the beginning of my book to describe what happened. The dogs were restless, penned in their cages in the basement of the Institute of Experimental Medicine. They were alone and weary from their daytime jobs in the professor's laboratory. But it wasn't the dark or the isolation or fatigue that got to them. It was the incessant dripping and lapping of water on the floor of their kennel.
Attack.
Although it started out as a fairly typical overcast day, the rain increased until the Neva River once again flooded, and it headed straight for the dogs. The water level in the kennel rose, and the dogs started barking. At first, their paws sloshed around in the chilly water, but as the hours went by, the water covered their bellies and shoulders until they were half floating in the cages, with their nostrils pressed anxiously against the wire mesh in the cages. They howled in fear and desperately snuffled the air. At the last moment, a dog handler raced through the flooded streets to the Institute, where he encountered panicked dogs and floating cages. One by one, he rescued the dogs, but first he had to force their heads under the water to get them out of the cages. The dogs were never the same. Their dispositions changed dramatically. The meek became aggressive and the gregarious became shy. It was as if an entirely new being inhabited each dog. This was bad enough, but the researchers were also struck by the fact that the dogs had forgotten all of the complex learning they had acquired in the laboratory. The dogs' memories were wiped clean. The staff talked about the dogs' memory loss for weeks, and the scientists wrote their colleagues about this strange event. This might have been dismissed as a curiosity, except that it took place in the laboratory of the Nobel laureate Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov built his career on meticulous observation and experimentation. For the rest of his life, he talked about the flood, and his comments about traumatic stress and memory reverberated widely, given his relationship with Russia's communist leaders. This would all have led just to scientific papers except for Lenin's interests. He visited Pavlov's laboratory and asked Pavlov's help in molding the new Soviet man to build the new world of communism. Pavlov asked, "Do you mean you would like to standardize the population of Russia, make them all behave in the same way?" Lenin said, "Exactly, and you will help us." The Soviets handsomely supported Pavlov, funded him with over 350 researchers for his institutes. Stalin also protected Pavlov, even during the Great Terror, when Stalin attacked so many prominent Russians. Pavlov was safe. There has always been a suspicion that Pavlov influenced how prominent party officials were interrogated and induced to make unusual confessions during the show trials. Bukharin was the principal target of the third show trial. Charged with plotting to assassinate Lenin and Stalin and give Soviet territories to Japan, Germany, and Great Britain. He abjectly confessed to it all, saying, "I have no intention of recanting anything I have confessed. The monstrousness of my crimes is immeasurable."
Tango down.
Other leading Soviets similarly confessed, saying things like, "There is no country on earth filled with such happy people. Farewell, my beloved country." Observers wondered how the Soviets extracted such confessions. They used a mixture of techniques, including solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, constant interrogation, and demands for confession. They alternated brutality and kindness, all imposed methodically and patiently, like a scientific experiment. When Pavlov died in 1949, a glowing obituary in Pravda commented on his accomplishments in achieving unlimited power over the work of the brain. It is interesting that in the ensuing cases of coercive persuasion in the 20th century, Pavlov's name is invariably mentioned. When World War II broke out, the Allies and Axis countries turned away from a preoccupation with show trials and confession and focused instead on drugs for interrogation, or as they called it, truth serum. Could a way be found to extract information from the enemy rapidly and reliably? Could one protect one's own agents or soldiers from disclosing secrets under truth serum? Truth serums were drugs that were redeployed for new purposes. In obstetrics, various drugs were studied to help the pain of childbirth. They became popular after John Snow treated Queen Victoria with chloroform. German doctors found that a combination of scopolamine and morphine was safe and effective in eliciting what they called Dämmerschlaf, or twilight sleep. In 1916, Ferris, Texas obstetrician Robert House performed a home delivery in a farmhouse using the twilight sleep protocol. He observed a curious phenomenon. After delivering the baby, he looked around for a kitchen scale to weigh the child. No one knew where it was. When the mother, who was still under anesthesia, piped up and said, "The scales are in the kitchen on the nail behind the picture." House was intrigued. He became convinced that twilight sedation made it impossible to lie. Furthermore, he was convinced that the jails were full of people who were wrongly convicted. Sheriffs, prosecutors, and defense attorneys sought him out to interrogate prisoners to learn the truth. His technique rapidly achieved worldwide prominence. This illustration of Dr. House and a prison inmate comes from a textbook of forensic psychiatry published in Spain almost a century ago. Meanwhile, psychiatrists were experimenting with drugs to treat catatonia, fugue, or dissociative memory loss and battle fatigue. Various barbiturate compounds could get patients talking and remembering. My old professor Lindemann noted that after administering barbiturates, there was a feeling of well-being and serenity, a desire to communicate, a willingness to speak about very personal problems usually not spoken of to strangers. These observations on drugs and truth-telling were of great importance to the military in World War II. The Nazis experimented on Dachau prison concentration camp inmates, spiking their coffee with mescaline to see if people would confide their secrets. The Nazis noted that the prisoners became more talkative, but were unconvinced about the drug's utility for military purposes. Meanwhile, the United States set up a secret commission to study if truth drugs could be developed to speed interrogation of prisoners of war. Curiously, they focused a great deal on marijuana. The OSS worked with leading academics to study how useful such drugs were and to investigate if people could really be compelled to tell the truth. The drugs were hardly infallible, and eventually Justice Potter Stewart ruled that a confession induced by the administration of drugs is constitutionally inadmissible in a criminal trial. That doesn't stop frustrated courts from occasionally considering their use, most recently in the case of mass shooter James Holmes in Colorado. After World War II ended, the world sighed with relief, but it was a short sigh, terminated by worldwide confrontation between East and West. It wasn't just about empire, land, and trade. The Cold War was also a fervent battle about doctrine and efforts to convert the enemy. Thus, coercive persuasion entered the next chapter. The Cold War started off with another show trial, this time involving Hungarian Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty. This slide shows a before and after view of the cardinal. He was an ardent Hungarian nationalist who opposed any encroachment on the rights of the church. He was imprisoned, placed in solitary, starved so much that he lost 50% of his body weight, beaten and drugged. But what got to him most was the solitude. He wrote, "The quiet of solitary destroys the nerves. The monotony shatters the nervous system and wears the soul thin." He eventually confessed to a series of unlikely deeds like trying to steal the Hungarian crown jewels. The West assumed that the confessions were elicited through some special communist breakthrough in coercive persuasion. Meanwhile, half a world away, the biggest flashpoint of the Cold War took place in Korea. It was a vicious conflict fought in extreme conditions. The United States was unprepared for the war, sent troops to Korea in the dead of winter, dressed in summer tropical uniforms, and the front lurched repeatedly north and south. In the first year of the war, many American troops were captured. There were high death rates amongst the POWs, and many collaborated with the enemy by broadcasting anti-war messages. When the armistice was finalized, all prisoners were given a choice of where they wanted to be relocated. We crowed when thousands of Chinese and North Koreans repudiated going home and preferred to settle in the West. We were absolutely flummoxed when about 20 American POWs refused to come home, preferring instead to settle in China or Russia. How had this happened? What happened to them in the prison camps? A retired OSS propaganda agent, Edward Hunter, invented a new term for this behavior, brainwashing. He wrote, "In brainwashing, a fog settles over the patient's mind until he loses touch with reality. Brainwashing is something new, which is contrary to human nature and inseparable from communism." He didn't exactly invent the new word. Rather, he took a complex Chinese term, xinao, and repurposed it in a lurid term of brainwashing. U.S. military experts hated his terminology, found it flamboyant and misleading. Instead, they preferred coercive persuasion, a much more accurate term. But brainwashing to this day is the favored terminology in popular culture. If you do a Google search on brainwashing, you discover over 34 million web pages on this topic. Compare that to coercive persuasion with its 48,000 web pages. The Chinese treated prisoners with a mixture of brutality and kindness. There was an unusual methodical quality to their efforts. They subjected POWs to ceaseless propaganda, forced them to write long confessions, and placed them in groups where they denounced each other. Not only did they get POWs to confess to war crimes and make anti-war propaganda broadcasts, but the Chinese seemed to get better results over time. In the course of just a year and a half, the percent of POWs caving into pressure increased from 25% to 75%. POWs who started collaborating with the enemy were treated better, and at the time of the armistice, some declined to return home. America viewed this with consternation. On the one hand, there was fear that the Chinese had deployed some secret weapon invented by Pavlov. On the other hand, our troops were viewed as cowards for caving in. There was no understanding of what they had been through. This Herb Block cartoon captures the mood at home. Two executives sit in their private club discussing world events while drinking and smoking cigars. One says to the other that he would never have caved in. Instead, he would have said to the Reds, "Now see here." People lost sight of the fact that the POWs were treated with extraordinary brutality. Indeed, the POW death rates in Korea exceeded those found in Japan or Vietnam. Two critics of the Korean War were particularly harsh in their judgment of our soldiers, Major William Mayer and journalist Eugene Kincaid. To their mind, the GIs had no gumption, were victims of